Sociology, even though you're not personally responsible for this prize, which has changed my life. But I was particularly pleased because the paper I'm going to talk about was based on research I did at the Mass Observation Archive, of which I'm a considerable fan, and I have to say I have struggled really hard to get things published that has used material from the Mass Observation Archive. So it was particularly wonderful that not only did Sociology publish the paper, but that it awarded a prize too. So I think partly a prize for the Mass Observation Archive. Okay, so family secrets and memories. I wanted to start with thinking about what a sociological interest in family secrets might be. I'm sure all of you have family secrets and you may have personal interests in family secrets. But why is that? What does that matter in terms of sociology, and why should sociology concern itself, like, with things that may be seen by others as prurient or views of the world type stuff or whatever? And I offer three main reasons in the paper. One is to do with power and powerlessness and the workings of power in families, but also between families and the state. And certainly what became apparent from the research that I was doing is quite often family secrets get set up precisely to defend families against some of the sorts of things that you were talking about, actually, Henry, about maybe against social work intervention or moral intervention and moral opprobrium of the family. So families create secrets about things that they have apparently done wrong. Illegitimacy would be a prime example, particularly in, say, the 1950s, and indeed sometimes earlier than that, the desire to cover up the fact that a child might have been born a bastard and therefore subject to all kinds of legal regulations of a particular sort and so on. But also it works within the families. There are micro workings of power between family members. So I think what's interesting about family secrets is it points in different directions, as I say, between family and state and then within the family. So, for example, something like concealing the fact that you might be a homosexual from your parents or from your grandparents or whatever. So there may be secrets within families and so on that work in that way. I also see family secrets as a really good example of the workings of family practices. And I should be saying a bit more about that in my talk. But the keeping and sometimes the breaking of family secrets is often about bonding or about what anthropologists call dekinning. So, for example, well, if I use a personal example, I grew up never knowing I had a maternal uncle because he'd been cut out of the family altogether. He was dekinned, and the rest of the family bonded around the fact that this poor chap was, you know, the black sheep of the family, whatever it might have been. I don't even still now know what it was. So you have that way of on the one hand, bonding around a secret or dekinning people who are inconvenient in various ways. And this can preserve the integrity of or apparent unity of the family. And then I think that this is a concept I've used a lot from John Gillis's work on families. The idea of there are families that we live in and there are families we live by. And families we live by are the families in our imagination. They're usually not the ones we live in because ordinary families are so flawed, but we imagine that family life and other people's families offer all kinds of wonderful support and good things and happy relationships and so on. And I've always seen family secrets as a way of trying to turn the family you live in into the family that you would like to live by. In other words, you get rid of the bits that aren't quite right or aren't quite proper. They become the sort of secret bits. And you can present to the world a particular image of your family that accords to the ideal. And I think the more research, for example, one does... I used to get quite concerned about this when Margaret Thatcher was in power, because there was always that banging on about how wonderful the 1950s family was. And as somebody who grew up in a 1950s family, wasn't. You know, it simply wasn't. There were all sorts of things going on in that family. And yet the 50s family had a presentation to the world of a particular variety. Certainly when I went to Mass Observation Archive and read the stuff they have in their attic, you could see why the ideal of the 1950s family was sustained, because it seemed to be so stuffed full of secrets. So illegitimacy was hidden, homosexuality was hidden, everything was hidden in order to create this kind of idealised family form. So I see then family secrets, if you like, as a tool, this conceptual window, as I say, on everyday family life, and you can take it in a number of directions. So I see it in that kind of way, as I say, this window. I look at it in this paper at a more micro level, but you can ask bigger questions about why, for example, there was such a rush of family secrets around illegitimacy at certain times and so on. So you can take it up to other kinds of levels if you wish. Of course, the big problem that faced me was how on earth do you do research on family secrets? Now, I haven't got time to go into that, but I was really lucky to discover this particular archive in the Mass Observation Archive down at Sussex University. There had been a directive sent out to people who wrote for Mass Obs in 2000, and it was on family life, and within that there was a question on family secrets. So this is just as an indication of who wrote then. It's changed quite a lot now, actually, people who write for Mass Observation. It's much more mixed, but in 2000 there was this sort of lean towards women, 2/3, 1/3, basically, and older, retired people, essentially, but it has changed a bit. So types of family secrets, and I'm not going to say much about this, but one was able to discover there were certain kinds of types or categories of secrets that were there. The virtual myth is something like being related to royalty. There's quite a few of that kind of thing that people come up with. The shameful illness or disease, I've got an example of that in a minute. Personal grievance, somebody ran off with all the family's money, and that's why we're poor, that kind of thing, but nobody talks about it. This I found so fascinating, not least because it echoed a particular secret in my family, which is people lied about when they got married and when people were born, and all sorts, and why they died, but it was really quite a safe thing to do back then, because people didn't usually go off to Somerset House as it was and get copies of these certificates. Now, of course, it's a few click of a button, and so it's much harder. People would tear up or hide birth certificates or marriage certificates and so on. The most common secret I found, I'm going to dwell mostly on that, is a reproductive secret, and related to that, issues around homosexuality. Here's a quick example of a shameful illness. I had a cousin who had what was then called a nervous breakdown at the age of 21. My uncle and aunt, certainly with invested motives, but most misguidedly, didn't get any help after she refused to see a doctor herself. They kept up the pretense that B was not very well, and she lived in her room at their bungalow for perhaps 30 years. One February day she was found dead in the river. There were quite a few of those, also around disability. So children would simply be hidden away for years, and nobody really knew about them or what was wrong with them and so on. Homosexuality, this is a classic one. And then, of course, there's my husband's Uncle T, whom I've never met. The Uncle T in question was very well dressed and theatrical, and was sent away to America in the 1950s. So the only conclusion to be drawn was that he was gay. And although there were lots of whispers, nobody ever actually mentioned the word homosexual. We're talking church family here. These are written accounts, by the way, so this is what people actually wrote. The more modern version of this was they went to live in Brighton, so they weren't sent to America. And also allusions to being well-dressed was very frequent. So families and members. One of the things I think that this paper tries to point out is how significant memories are to the workings of families. And you can almost, as I say here, see families as collections of memories as much as they are collections of kin. And what most families do is they have knowledge, they have family stories, which they pass on down. So they tell stories about other kin, and so on. So a new arrival in the family is already embedded, if you like, in a long-running story. It's like, you know, a Dallas, you know, you arrive and you give an episode, but there have been all these episodes before, and there will be episodes thereon, and you get versions of things. You also, of course, get versions of your own childhood fed back to you and so on, and so one begins to understand the sort of construction of memory. So there's this embeddedness in what went before, and the past and the present become entwined with one another. And Barbara Mistel, who's written a fabulous book, I think, on memory, has basically argued there can be no sense of identity if you don't have a past, if you have no memory at all. So it gives you a sense of self. And the reason I'm stressing the importance of a sense of self is, of course, because if some of the family stories you're given you later discover not to be true, then in a sense part of that construction can actually have quite an effect on you. So it's not just, oh, how interesting. So the story about maybe somebody ran off or somebody was married to royalty or whatever may not have so much of an effect on you, but other particularly reproductive kinds of secrets and those sorts of stories may have greater significance. So she argues that, in fact, she uses the term mnemonic communities, that families are quintessentially the first place where you start to build up memories and you acquire memories, some of which are given to you and some of which were part of your own experience. But it's a circle of memory making is the family. So here I'm trying to say the importance of family stories which carry, and sometimes they become quite a rehearsed narrative. And what can sometimes be quite interesting is, as a narrative becomes more rehearsed and more fixed, then the fact that you may discover later on that it's not true may also in itself have a considerable impact. And if any of you have watched the Who Do You Think You Are series, or any of them sometimes, you will know that sometimes how distraught people are when they discover that somebody that they had been told, you know, was salt of the earth, etc., was actually a crook. It makes them cry. You might think, oh, you know, why would they cry? But actually, quite a lot can be invested in the idea of your antecedents being these noble, you know, folk who worked hard and so on and so forth. So memory then and secrets. Here was an interesting thing, of course, about researching secrets, because if something's a secret, people don't know about it and can't tell you about it. And clearly that's true, and certainly in the archive a number of people wrote things like, there probably were secrets, but they would never have told me any of them, so I still don't know what they are. So there clearly can be secrets that people don't know about because they're very successfully kept. But the other thing that came out very strongly was actually people often know there is a secret of some sort because certain things are spoken about in different kinds of ways. So you may not ever find out what the secret was, but you know there was a sort of area where if you approached it, you learn very quickly you shouldn't ask questions about that. Or, very often, you got different answers at different times. So some of the people wrote quite a lot about how they would ask a question and they'd be told, well, we married when I was 17, and then later on they were married when they were 19, or whatever it might be, these discrepancies in the stories. So memories then, memory itself is complex, it doesn't stay still, it changes over time. It's a chameleon in nature, because how we remember things, say, today might be quite different to how we remembered them 10 years ago and so on. But secrets themselves become very complex in this regard too, because we don't always hear a straight story in any way whatsoever. So we get this kind of meshing then of adult memory, sensibilities about childhood, silences and so on. And that's kind of what we're looking at. And here are some examples of what people had to say. One of the wonderful things about mass observation archive material is you have real gems in there about and how reflexive people are about the questions that they're asked to write about. So here is somebody saying these are not really secrets, they're more part of the mythology that accompanies old photographs. I wonder whether there are secrets and we just don't talk about them. So people say maybe it's too late, they've evaporated and so on. here is another example, maybe less reflexive, but wonderful, I think, sociological material. I do not like secrets and like everything out in the open. There are things that happen that sometimes are better kept to oneself. And that seemed really to me to capture the whole thing about secrets, and indeed our modern notion that transparency is wonderful as long as it's somebody else's transparency and not one's own. Or that you can be perfectly open, but there's this point where you stop being open, and then you keep those things to yourself. So there's a kind of, it's good to be open, but there's a certain decency where you stop being open. And remember, these are written, this is a written form, so it's kind of quite interesting. People do have control in a way they may not over interviews of kind of what they're saying, so I found that particularly interesting. So this is a very quick example, and I have restricted myself from giving you examples because I could have just read you all the secrets because they are fascinating. But this was a classic example of a woman who is talking about how oppressive her parents had been to her and her sister in their childhood. And she says, sometime in the 80s, when my parents had gone through a phase of particular nastiness towards my sister, and I happened to be working on the family tree, I decided to find out what they'd been hiding. I wrote to the Public Record Office for my full birth certificate and my parents' marriage certificate. What I discovered really shocked me because it turned out that my parents hadn't got married until I was 14 months old. Suddenly it all became clear. All that control over the children, all that suspicion, nastiness and stifling overprotection, that was because they didn't want us to turn out like them. They had made the mistake of producing an illegitimate child in an era when such a thing brought disgrace, and it seems to my siblings and me that our lives have been made to pay for that mistake. And this is a kind of interesting one because actually as her story goes on, she's very glad to have found this out. People aren't always very glad to have found out what they do find out, but for her, suddenly everything becomes clear. All the lies that have been in the past, and sort of confusions about births and marriages and all of those sorts of things. And clearly you have a situation there where, as I say, it's like a puzzle solved in this particular context. But I then wanted to look at, how are secrets managed in families, and it seemed to me that there were two axes in which secrets are managed. First of all, the idea of respectability and uprightness of character, and the other is discretion and active not knowing, and I particularly want to dwell on the active not knowing in a moment. So respectability. And this again, taken from one of the authors. There have been no family secrets in the sense that you mean, as I belong to a very respectable family. And again, I think that's a really very sort of powerful opening set of remarks. Because people were asked whether they had family secrets. Nobody defined for them what they should think a family secret was. But clearly this person had an idea of what a family secret was, and their family really wouldn't have it. Which then sets up for me a particularly whole sort of idealisation of, say, the 1950s or even earlier family. If you're so convinced your family is so respectable that it couldn't have family secrets, then you've got one elephant in the room and you don't see it. And this woman had a huge elephant in the room. She said there were really no secrets at all. But I suppose the closest my family came to having a secret was that my father had a younger brother and sister who were hidden away until they died. And it was never openly spoken of in the family and never mentioned at all by my father.
That's not a secret.
And there are issues around this where this person clearly didn't work it out, but if you read on in terms of her story, what becomes apparent is that these two children who were much younger than her father, were born maybe some 6 or 7 years after the father had been born, were syphilitic. The grandfather had come back from a war with a tropical disease. The children who were subsequently born were blind, very frail and feeble, had a nurse to look after them and so on. But it never came out, and I hated to think that I might think I know what was going on. She doesn't. But there's a sense in her story that actually her sister might know what's going on. But she is completely not going there, if you see what I mean, and has this idea of being so respectable that nothing awful could have possibly happened in their family. But then there's avoidance and active not knowing, and you will all know about this. We avoid straying into areas of conversation that might cause discomfort or annoyance to other members of the family. And I love the way that is sculpted, actually, that sort of comment. So this is a gay man, civil servant, who's writing that. And I don't think they would have been pleased. They may have guessed and preferred not to talk about it. We're talking obviously about homosexuality here in particular, but it wouldn't have to be homosexuality. So you know about it, but you don't know about it. And hence the concept of what, again, borrowing from anthropologists, the idea of active not knowing. You have to work quite hard not to know some things, but sometimes it's worth the effort, because if you acknowledge the thing, the elephant in the room, you may have to do something about it, or more importantly, relationships may not survive. So I am now. So family secrets, and particularly reproductive family secrets, or family secrets that relate to issues around sexuality, aren't simply information. They impact upon kind of the self, the construction of the family, what kind of family that might be. So I sometimes think if the woman who talked about how respectable her family was kind of knew what I think was going on in her family, that would be incredibly destructive for her. So it's really kind of important, if you like, that one doesn't go there. So in particular, I think reproductive secrets relate to identity, a form of ontological security. The people that you thought you knew aren't the people you thought you knew, so to speak. You know, how is it that you've got a very kind of prudish, say, set of parents, and then you discover they were having sex before they married and either conceived or maybe gave birth to a child beforehand, when their whole lives had been about something else, and then you might have to sort of deal with that. I have to say, though, sometimes people were delighted to discover the secret. There were quite a few lesbians who wrote, for example, about how wonderful it was to realise that their, in quotes, eccentric aunts were a lesbian couple, and they come from a lineage of lesbians. You know, so it can be positive. It doesn't always have to be a negative thing. And this is Marilyn Strathern. She says, "We shall not understand people's reluctance or their desire to not know, or anxieties about where information will lead, unless we realise that kinship knowledge has certain built-in effects." So in other words, people will keep these secrets, will not go there, will leave the elephant in the room, because they don't necessarily know what the consequences might be, which could be maybe some kind of disintegration of the family. And so my argument is, again, coming back to the kind of sociological import of this work, is that it's a way, tracking family secrets is a way of linking personal, cultural, historical and social elements. Introduces issues of memory, myth, the extra-literal. And again, you know, you can take it wide. I won't go on reading out this kind of list. But it's a very sensitive area. You have to be really careful, because, in a sense, you don't want to explode people's secrets, and it really does matter to people, the keeping of secrets and so on. So I think one shouldn't sort of march all over people's secrets as if somehow they are just preposterous or unnecessary or whatever. They're really, really important. And so I think family secrets can, if you like, unlock some of these family practices, and they're not just historical